Back.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. On the 2nd and 3rd of September in this place, two Labor senators, both Western Australian senators, made speeches, or should I say the same speech, because each replicated the other and followed the other almost verbatim, highly critical of the Chevron company, and particularly the Gorgon project and to a lesser extent the Wheatstone project off the Western Australian coast. I don't need to quote from both, I can just quote from one of them. One was Senator Lyons, the other Senator Sterle, and they made reference to direct construction jobs, 3,500 on Barrow Island where Gorgon's established, 10,000 direct or indirect jobs at the peak construction, 300 direct jobs afterwards. It caused me to ask the question, Acting Deputy President, why would two senators, two Western Australian senators, stand in this place and be highly critical of projects that are bringing billions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars of employment, hundreds of thousands of jobs going over 30 or 40 years, and making allegations about mismanagement, making allegations, and again I'll repeat one or the other, the Gorgon project, I'm quoting from both, unfortunately is quickly becoming synonymous, each word the same, with white elephant mega projects. Some analysts show that it is the most delayed, over-budget LNG project in Australia, yet Chevron, each of them says, gave its shareholders extremely rosy projections and only very slowly revived cost and delay estimates. Each of them went on, Acting Deputy President, to make disparaging comments about the occupational health and safety records on those particular projects and called into question the actual undertakings of the Chevron company to the Western Australian and the Australian governments in relation to the size of these projects. Both of them finished up, slightly different I must say. One of them actually said, "So concerned am I about this project in Western Australia." The other one saying, "As a Western Australian, so concerned am I about the failure of Chevron to live up to its obligations." I come back to the other one, to live up to its obligations to the people of Western Australia. One of them wrote to the US Securities Exchange Commission asking for a full accounting of Gorgon's projects, risks and prospects, and the others wrote to Chevron in the USA, expressing my concerns about what I believe to be Chevron's overpromised and under-delivered commitments. It caused me to ask the question, what are Western Australian senators doing bucketing probably what is the largest oil and gas exploration and production project in our history? And of course, I immediately came to an article in the Sydney Morning Herald of the 28th of August 2014, some 4 days before Senator Lyons' contribution. And of course that was one in which the Maritime Union of Australia is considering, it says in the Sydney Morning Herald, legal action against the US oil and gas giant Chevron with regard to breaching its obligations. Both of these speeches clearly written by the MUA. It causes you to ask the question, Madam Acting Deputy President, why would the MUA be wanting to go into bat against Chevron? Well, of course, that even goes back further to an article, again, if I can quote from The Australian on the 16th of August, energy giant Chevron is suing the militant Maritime Union of Australia for more than $20 million over an illegal strike the company says caused delays and cost blowouts to its $57 billion Gorgon gas project in Western Australia's Pilbara. That goes back to 2012, Madam Acting Deputy President, where a strike took place at the Australian Marine Complex at Henderson, south of Perth in Coburn Sound, in which there was clearly a slowing of project work, completion work, loading and transport up to Barrow Island of the Gorgon project. So at that time, the company Chevron went to Fair Work Australia. Fair Work Australia ruled that the strike was illegal and that these people should return to work, but of course the company would say that they then went on a go slow, costing them more than $20 million. Bit ironic that two colleagues in this place would actually then start complaining about the antics, apparently, of the Chevron company. Well, I, as a Western Australian senator, was so concerned about these allegations by my colleagues that I actually made it my business to go and find out what the truth was, because one of them, I think, Senator Lyons, made the observation that these were claims by Chevron which can't be easily validated or measured. These are the claims relating to construction jobs, completion jobs, operation jobs and the value of the project. Well, I didn't find it all that hard, Madam Acting Deputy President. I actually got in touch with the company, strangely enough. You wouldn't have to do too much to do that, would you? And let me tell you what the actual figures are. Remember, the claim by Senators Lyon and Sterle, 3,500 jobs in construction, 10,000 in direct or indirect jobs related. Well, here are the figures. Not 10, but 20,000 jobs. Not 10, but 20. 7,000 on Barrow Island building Gorgon, which is now 80% complete, 5,000 at Wheatstone off Onslow, nearly 40% complete. It's better. The projects have injected over $30 billion in local content and jobs, and that will climb to $40 billion over the next couple of years. 600 Australian companies, over 90% Western Australian, have been awarded contracts. These projects will go, of course, over 30 or 40 years. Let me tell you a little bit about the salary levels of people on these projects. The barge welders, according to APIA, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, are earning around $400,000 a year. Maritime workers covered by the Federal Offshore Maritime Agreements are paid over $200,000 for working 5 weeks on, 5 weeks off and still getting their annual leave. Not a bad deal, Madam Acting Deputy President. None of us would mind it. The Prime Minister of Australia isn't earning $400,000 for working half the year or less, and yet these are the levels of salaries upon which my colleagues are bitterly complaining and exercising criticism of this company. Onslow, where the Wheatstone project is under construction, the beneficiary of some $250 million of social infrastructure funding, improvements to power, water, a new hospital, at least being extended, new community swimming pool, airports, roads, $60 million being awarded to Onslow-based firms. Why would colleagues be complaining about a project of this scale when it's creating this level of employment and wealth to our state? 50 new homes. Those of you that don't know Onslow, Madam Acting Deputy President, it's a very small, humble coastal location. The second allegation, for which I object most strongly and sought information, was an apparent claim of occupational health and safety so severe, that the union was caused to make direct contact with Mr Roy Krasinski, the Managing Director of Chevron in WA. Well, to my information, Mr Krasinski has had no contact from the MUA. So therefore, I sought the information and I seek leave, Madam Acting Deputy President, to place on the record in Hansard graphs indicating the number of days away from work per 200,000 hours worked.
Is the Senator seeking leave to table the document? Yes. Is leave granted?
The figures that I want to give you, this is this company apparently, Madam Acting Deputy President, that's so shocking in its occupational health and safety that in the year 2013 it recorded some 20 million days free of a single day away from work. 20 million days away from work. When you have a look at that graph, as I've invited people around the chamber to do, you will see the construction industry has the highest rate, around about 1.8 to 2 days per 200,000, coming right down, and you will find oil and gas generally down around 0.2 to less, the Chevron company down less than 0.2, in fact less than 0.1 days per 200,000 days work. I don't mind a decent debate, but I will not stand by and watch the high repute of companies such as this one being trashed when this information is clearly available to anybody who wants to see it. 6 times the safety rate of others in equivalent industries. But the news gets better, Acting Deputy President. This project, Gorgon, has awarded more than 500 contracts to Australian companies and spent more than $27 billion already on Australian goods and services, principally, of course, in Western Australia. The flow-on effect, 270 Pilbara-based organisations benefiting from the Gorgon project. In Perth, 10,000 jobs, 10,000 jobs, as well as more jobs in the Pilbara. Up to date, Madam Acting Deputy President, 30,000 have completed the project induction course during construction. These are very, very fine figures. Allegations and challenges have been made about cost overruns. Yes, $37 billion, I think up to $54 billion. A delay in completion time, the biggest oil and gas project I think ever undertaken. You would expect to see some of these factors. I ask the question, why is the Maritime Union and why are the Senate colleagues not supporting projects of such a scale and such a nature? I could go on at length about the training programs, about the training undertaken in occupational health and safety, Madam Acting Deputy President. But of course, all of that information is there to be seen. And I think when one reflects on the figures themselves, when one reflects on the contribution of this particular company and project, not only to the Western Australian but to the Australian economy, one has only got to ask, why would they be levelling these allegations? Mr Martin Ferguson, once the highly respected minister in the Labor government, has made the observation that industry-wise, the LNG industry in 2011-12 earned $12 billion in export revenue and put $30 billion into the Australian economy. It paid $8 billion in tax. There are $200 billion of new projects underway, and there's 100,000 jobs in this economy as a result of oil and gas activity. And by 2020, Madam Acting Deputy President, if only we can keep the big players in the game, if only we can remain or become competitive again, the opportunity is there for Australia to be earning annually in excess of some $12 billion per year in tax revenues. This evening is not the time for me to expand on where the risks and the problems are associated with our offshore oil and gas industry, except to say we are rushing towards non-competitiveness. Already, our costs are some 30% higher to deliver gas into the Japanese market than some of our competitors, including Canada and Mozambique. But I will talk about that in greater detail, Madam Acting Deputy President, when the time permits. I do want to this evening extend my discussion as a result of these comments on the oil and gas industry, because it goes to the competitiveness of the Western Australian economy. It goes to the competitiveness and its value to the Australian economy and what is being held back and why. When I came into this place in 2009, in my first speech in the Senate, I made the observation that the Western Australian community is getting 87 cents back for each dollar of GST contributed, and that was costing the Western Australian economy some $300 million a year. That 87 went down to 57 by 2011. Today, Madam Acting Deputy President, for each dollar that Western Australia generates, we are getting back 37.6 cents, and that is costing the Western Australian economy some $3.7 billion per annum. 3.7. So this is the top performing state. Can you imagine in a relay race that you penalise and put heavy boots on your fastest runner in the relay? That's exactly what's happening in this state at the moment. Western Australia in the GST component is contributing some $20 billion to the other states and territories. And where is it going? To Queensland, $600 million, $1,475 per person. To South Australia, $746 million, over $4,000 per person annually. To Tasmania, $500 million, $7,600. Even to the ACT, $140 million is going out of Western Australia's pockets, and to the Northern Territory some $1.73 billion, about $10,000 per person. Madam Acting Deputy President, time doesn't permit this evening to go fully into the background of the whole question of GST distribution, but what I can say is this, and Senator Scullion should certainly not think for 1 minute that Western Australia is in any way trying to deprive the Northern Territory. What's happened since the GST's come in, Madam Acting Deputy President, is that where once the Commonwealth supported the Northern Territory and the ACT, that has now shifted, and most of the contribution from the four larger states in their GST contributions now goes to the territories, particularly to the Northern Territories. The states are now funding the Northern Territory. No one's suggesting the Northern Territory doesn't need these funds, but of course it is the origin of those funds. People say, oh, traditionally Western Australia was favoured in the Grants Commission process. The Grants Commission process came about after 1933, when the Western Australian community voted during a referendum at an election to secede. The Grants Commission came into existence, and let me make this point very, very strongly, Madam Acting Deputy President. The equalisation process took place in Western Australia's favour to compensate for unfair tariff protection which existed in the larger and manufacturing states. It was never a subsidy. It was never a subsidy, it was compensation. Compensation for the high tariffs that then existed in the manufacturing states. And we all know what the impact of tariffs are. That's all been discovered now. The impact of tariffs, of course, is to remove competitiveness, because those industries no longer are encouraged to compete internationally because they are receiving protection. I would also remind colleagues that in the 1960s, whilst we heard the other day of the efforts of the then Menzies government, documentation signed by the grandfather of Prime Minister Abe of Japan, it was the David Brand Charles Court team in Western Australia that had to fight Canberra tooth and nail to open up the iron ore export industry. Today we take it for granted. Today we take the value, the more than 1 million tonnes a day that is exported out of our northern ports of Port Hedland. We take that for granted. In the 1960s, Brand and Court had to fight tooth and nail to actually establish that industry with Japanese investment, and of course we know the history. North West Shelf, a circumstance again in which the Alcoa company agreed on a take-or-pay basis to take gas, and the Western Australian government, led by Sir Charles Court, took the risk of a take-and-pay arrangement when there was no gas available in the south. So the circumstances existed when GST distribution comes around. A very, very strong point that I want to make is this. The simple fact, along with others in the formula, there should be an inclusion in each of the state and territories, a capacity to earn revenue. And the performance of that state or territory against that preset goal for revenue should actually determine in some way the contribution that that state or territory receives. What we must have is a return to GST distribution based on a per capita basis up to a certain level, Madam Acting Deputy President, beyond which there is a reserve fund which the government, under a formula, be it the Grants Commission or whatever replaces it, can actually make those allocations to states or territories that require it. But when you get to a circumstance in which we have deteriorated from 87 cents to 37, surely anybody can see, in the analogy of the relay team, the team won't do any good if the best performer is being held back. And that's the circumstance we find ourselves in now. In fact, the State Treasurer and State Premier have made the observation that that 37 cents is at risk, in a situation in which iron ore prices today went down to below $80 a tonne. Now that's $43 a tonne less than the Western Australian Treasury's estimate for iron ore prices. And of course that impact is massive. For each dollar below the forecast figure, you can look at $50 million of lost revenue, which of course must have its impact on the Western Australian and therefore the Australian economy. Again, time doesn't permit this evening, Madam Acting Deputy President, except to say that we have a circumstance now as a result of imbalance where the federal government is earning 80% of the revenue and expending about 50% of the national expenditure. The states, on the other hand, are earning 15% of the revenue and are also responsible for somewhere around about just under 50%. The balance, of course, being made from local governments. So, Madam Acting Deputy President, this federation is in somewhat of a quandary. And I come back to the point that I made at the beginning of this contribution. If we are not going to have, led from this Australian Parliament, led from the senators in it, led from those in the Senate who are representative of the states, if we're not going to have a circumstance in which we parliamentarians support the sorts of industries in this place that actually create wealth, then we are in a very, very unfortunate circumstance.
I thank the senator for his remarks on behalf of the people of Western Australia.